is China now one giant credit Ponzi and money laundering scheme? So when the facts change, so does my opinion. People in the gold community, people in the alternative media, apparently, after 10 years of the facts changing, apparently their opinion does not change. It's still the same narrative. And so in today's live stream, first of all, I want to wish everyone a happy Halloween if they're American. Hopefully they've had a pretty nice night trick-or-treating with their kids or themselves, or going to parties and stuff. But, based on some of the stuff that's come out recently, I think the facts, there's now 10 years worth of evidence that the information, the facts have changed about China. And to use a poker analogy, they have overplayed their hand. And the absolute best case scenario for China is going to be what happened to Japan 30 or 40 years ago. And you know what? If half of what Miles Kwok and Kyle Bass have said on the Real Vision TV interviews the last couple weeks is true, if half of what they said is true, then China's going to be very, very lucky if they turn out what happened with Japan. It's going to be very, very lucky. Because they laid out the case basically how now China got greedy, they overplayed their hand, and basically now China's one giant Ponzi scheme with credit, and they're basically laundering an obscene amount of money using the RMB, the quantitative easing programs, the credit programs and stuff, and they're laundering out of the country to turn in Hong Kong and other areas, and then taking that money and going and buying real assets with it, whether it's real estate or physical gold. So I hear gold bugs all the time say China has over 25,000 tons of gold. Okay, well, maybe they have over 25,000. Maybe they have over 30. Maybe they have over 40. But you know what? If they are intentionally, if the Chinese Communist Party, their government isn't, and their banking system and their corruption there is intentionally hyperinflating their currency and is willing to, we have to put things in perspective. So it took China only 10 years to create tens of trillions of dollars of credit into their economy. And by the way, their GDP, Kyle Bass on his Twitter has a very interesting short little video. Go to Kyle Bass's Twitter. If you don't have Real Vision TV, if you don't want to pay $180 a year for the content, go to Kyle Bass's Twitter, check it out. He has a little video on there. And so on the video, he shows basically that China has printed with quantitative easing more than twice their GDP. Okay, it's not normal. Central planning, it's corruption. And, I've talked about, in the last live stream, I talked about Donald Rumsfeld and, known knowns, known unknowns, and then unknown unknowns. And occasionally, we get a whistleblower or someone who's willing to change sides, or a billionaire, sometimes like Donald Trump, who used to, be a globalist, and then at least at some point, and then he switched. And so it appears that this Chinese billionaire named Miles Kwok, who's now kind of an enemy of the Chinese, I guess he is a total enemy of the Chinese government. And if some of the stuff he said is true, and it's sounding like, because he's made some predictions over the past couple of years, and some of the stuff he's predicted has come true already. But if more of his predictions come true, it sounds like, this quantitative easing and this credit bubble that China's doing, number one, an enormous amount of the credit that China's created, there's just a super high percentage of non-performing loans. There's been Bank of China members that have publicly talked about it over the last year. The head of the People's Bank of China, there were rumors that they were going to force him to resign because he came out and spoke out against it, warning about the credit bubble and the non-performing loans. There was another former member of the People's Bank of China earlier this year in one of the Chinese newspapers that's in English. I posted in the Wall Street for Main Street Facebook group. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that China has just gone crazy with the amount of credit. And the U.S. economy, it took a very, very long time for the U.S. economy to start issuing like tens of trillions of dollars in credit and money printing. China has done it in unprecedented speed. And people tell me, the gold bugs tell me, and they tell me this every day. They message me. I'm friends with these guys. They don't look at any of the other facts. They just see their whatever narrative they want to see, confirmation bias, that, petro yuan contract volumes are up. That means China's doing well. But you don't look at the credit that China has. China could have, 40,000 tons of physical gold, but if they're going to let their credit go to tens of trillions of dollars of credit and it's going to explode, it's not going to do them a whole bunch of good to have the gold when their credit is going out of control like that, okay? So they've mismanaged things. There's going to be problems in China too, okay? I'm not saying that there's not problems in the United States. There's big problems in the US and China. And I think that's the problem that a lot of people in the gold community and a lot of people in the alternative media have, is that over the last 10 years, things have changed a lot in China. China's even talking now, despite their credit problems, despite their non-performing loans, the massive amounts of them. Miles Kwok said that the non-performing loan amount is over 45% already. I've heard estimates a lot higher than that. I believe there was an article earlier this year from a former People's Bank of China member, and he said the non-performing loans could be closer to 80%. But you have a really high amount of Chinese GDP, and their GDP is fake, just like the U.S. government's GDP is not that good, but the Chinese one is probably more fake than the U.S. government's GDP. And a really, really high amount, I've heard upwards of 60%, Jim Chanos said this, and Jim Chanos is short a lot of Chinese stuff. He's not always right, but he's right a lot more than he's wrong. And he says that 60% of Chinese GDP is based on speculative real estate. So it's not going to end well for China. But, if China has gold, then the gold bugs are going to say that China's going to do well. Well, the Chinese government actually, they've been, from what it sounds like, Ate, if, I'm reading your comments here, if what Miles Kwok said is true and Kyle Bass said is true on the Real Vision TV interviews over the last week, and Kyle Bass gave an interview 2 weeks ago, well, it was released 2 weeks ago with Grant Williams. If what they said is true, it sounds like China has been intentionally hyperinflating their currency, the RMB, doing quantitative easing, and then intentionally the corrupt people at the top and at the head of their corporations and banking system and the head of their government, they are intentionally laundering the RMB into Hong Kong, into other areas, converting it to dollars or other better currencies, and then immediately buying assets with it. So Miles Kwok talks about this. Some of the claims in there are just nuts. He basically said that the elites in charge of the Chinese economy, the head of the families and stuff that are running the Chinese Communist Party, are literally laundering many billions of dollars per day. So if that number adds up, you're looking at well over a couple $1 trillion per year that China is buying in foreign real estate, in stocks, in other assets. China could print up RMB, launder it into another currency, and then just buy physical gold if they're getting away with it now. So from what Miles Kwok has said, it sounds like they've been doing that. Now, I don't know if everything he said is true or not, but look, I would encourage you to go and watch the interview if you have Real Vision TV. He has made some outlandish claims, but some of his predictions have also come true. But there's another thing there about Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong runs a dollar peg and China runs a dollar peg, and people in the gold community and people in the alternative media are like, China's going to dump all their treasuries. China's going to dump all their dollars. China's going to crash the U.S. economy. How is China going to crash the U.S. economy if they're still running a dollar peg, if they still need to accumulate dollars? Because it sounds like there's a dollar shortage in China now. Sounds like they got greedy. Sounds like they did some stupid stuff. And the example I want to do that, although it is smaller, it used to be considered free market, is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has had a dollar peg, I believe, for a very long time. But now Hong Kong, I think in just the last, 6 years or so, Hong Kong's reserves that they were using to defend their dollar peg, they've blown through over 70% of their reserves to defend their currency peg. So it's obviously not sustainable for Hong Kong to continue to do this. And Miles Kwok was saying, and Kyle Bass, I guess, was mostly agreeing with him, they were discussing this in their interview, that basically mainland China, the Chinese Communist Party, is going to have to eventually absorb Hong Kong. Then, because Hong Kong's not going to be able to continue to run the dollar peg at the level. They're going to run out of reserves. And it sounds like, a ton of mainland Chinese money has been parked in Hong Kong. That's why Hong Kong has real estate bubbles, and, the cost of real estate there is just astronomical. But yeah, I encourage you to watch this stuff. Okay, so I skipped over some stuff because I was trying to get you guys the good content first. So I want to first thank my Patreon account contributors. Over 70 of you now. Thank you guys very much. YouTube keeps screwing me. My AdWords revenues go down for some reason, and no matter what. Anyways, I want to thank my Patreon account contributors. There's 70 of you. Thank you very much. Stupid disclaimer. So, Everything discussed in here is for informational and educational purposes only. It is only my opinion. I am not a financial advisor. So if I talk about gold or China or Chinese technology companies that are probably committing accounting fraud, it's just my opinion. I will cite you some research. I will not give financial advice. You can go and do your own due diligence, hopefully, and not go and gamble all of your savings on junior mining stocks. Okay, done with the disclaimer. Yeah, so last month I was reading an article from Alasdair Macleod, and I'm friends with Alasdair Macleod. I've interviewed him a number of times over the years. Very smart guy. However, if you read his article from last month about gold and China and stuff like that, it's as if the last basically 7 or 8 years never even happened. So he totally ignores the credit bubble, all the problems in China, all the stuff that has happened to China, to the global economy the last 7 or 8 years. It's basically, if you go and read a lot of his articles, as if we're back in 2010 or 2011, and all the crazy things that the central banks have done, that the Chinese have done, it's a little hoarse voice there, probably needs some water, has never even happened. And this is the problem with the gold community. I like the product that Gold Money has, but probably also the problem with Gold Money, because they're paying Alasdair God knows how much money, and then Gold Money won't even fulfill a signed paid advertising contract with me for $500 a month that was signed in January. So they'll pay him to write those articles, director research, give him stock options, talk about how good gold is and how China's going to crash the dollar, and they won't even fulfill a paid advertising contract they have with me that's signed, that's up in their corporate headquarters in Toronto. They told me to go pound sand. So if there's any lawyers that are good that want to help me sue Gold Money, that would be funny. Okay. I dropped the company name, guys. That screwed me over in the advertising contract. They deserve it, man. Gold Money has a good product, but what they did was very unprofessional. Not cool at all. Hey, it's already cost me almost over $6,000 in that commissions. Okay, so back to the content. So, I was talking about Francine McKenna, and she had this great, she was for those of you not familiar with her, she writes articles for MarketWatch, but before that, she was a forensic accountant for over 25 years with the Big Four accounting firms. And unlike some of the corrupt ones, she was actually like a good, honest, hardworking one. And so she started writing books, she started writing articles exposing accounting frauds. And I think she's a forensic accountant professor now here in DC, but she also writes all these articles for MarketWatch and on her website, Read the Auditors, and she highlights, basic blatant accounting fraud now in a lot of publicly traded companies. By the way, there's over 90% of all S&P 500 companies that are listed on a publicly traded U.S. stock exchange, they are all using non-GAAP. So all of their financials might not be non-GAAP, but at least portions of them are non-GAAP, which is very worrisome. But I mean, no one's going to prison for accounting fraud, right? So look at the shit that Elon Musk has gotten away with. Even after the FBI investigations and all this other stuff, the stock still ended up, right? So the news was announced that the FBI was expanding the investigation further, and Tesla stock actually went up. Welcome to dystopia, right? Just crazy, crazy times we live in. And then all the violence escalating. I mean, all the stupid... There's so many news stories to talk about with the celebrities and all this violence escalating. And the mainstream media is just fanning the flames. Maybe the globalists do want to use like an ideological civil war in the United States for depopulation. I hope I'm wrong about this with violence, but that's where things are going right now, unfortunately. And I don't see things getting better. Okay, so back to the content. So China has a lot of problems. The gold community, the alternative media, mostly not talking about it, unfortunately. And if you want to do more research on this, there is the Hidden Forces podcast that Dimitri Kofinas runs. He's been interviewing over the last year a number of authors of books who have actually lived in mainland China, like Americans or Europeans who lived there a decade or more. And so they're writing books now about all the debt problems in China, the problem with the Chinese financial system, I forgot, the shadow banking system, all those different problems, the financial problems, and how it's basically being papered over. Now, if you add all this stuff up with what Miles Kwok says, it's extremely alarming. So China is buying gold. The gold demand is up 42% globally year over year for physical gold. A lot of other central banks have bought. But China may be doing this with printed RMB. So the Chinese government then has basically figured, if they are doing this and printing RMB and then laundering the money and then buying gold with it, they have basically done modern day financial alchemy, because they're not getting in trouble for it right now, and they have figured out how to turn straw into gold. Yes, Nick, Chinese do love to gamble. Those are the lower citizens. I don't know about the upper elites. The upper elites seem more conservative. They seem like, with their stolen money laundered stuff, they seem to want to buy real estate in like Vancouver or Australia, London, different states in the United States, Toronto. They seem a little bit more conservative about taking the money, where they put the money that they've taken. And, a lot of Chinese citizens are very, very book smart, but it seems that they're very, very brainwashed. Now, Americans are brainwashed too, but it seems that Chinese are a different kind of brainwash, because they seem to be going along with the social credit score stuff. It's really scary. Hopefully it doesn't come to the United States. Hopefully we do not have a social credit score here. I mean, I'm already getting zeroed. They'd probably have me on house arrest. And I heard that they do that in China. I heard there was an investigative journalist who exposed a big corruption scandal in mainland China. The guy had over 2 million followers on social media. I was reading this article from an Australian paper. And this guy, in America, it would have been applauded. Investigative journalist exposed corruption, right? Doing the public good. He's doing a good job at doing the public good. I think he even found a serial killer. He went through old cases, and he did work instead of the police, and he helped catch a serial killer in mainland China. And what happened to him for exposing the corruption, embarrassing Chinese officials, is he got blacklisted. He got such a low social credit score, he lost his job, and he basically was being monitored 24/7, 365. He's on house arrest. So and the guy has a family. I guess he's gonna have to leave if they're gonna allow him to leave. So the gold bugs and the alternative media people defending China nonstop. I really think that they have not studied what has happened in the last 10 years. Things are very different in China now than they were 10 years ago, especially with the amount of credit. China just gone crazy. The misallocation of capital, even a lot of the infrastructure projects that China's done. I've heard reports that a lot of from listeners who moved to mainland China, that the buildings that were recently just built are already becoming decrepit. So there's big problems in China too. Yes, Michael, there's shadow inflation everywhere. There's shadow inflation everywhere. No government's telling the truth about that. And the other stuff about China, for research, I want to get this out there. So if you want to learn, the Chinese government has also been for decades now here in the United States, been buying influence, buying corruption. And there's a book out by Peter Schweitzer. He wrote Clinton Cash, for those of you who are familiar, the book and the documentary. And his new book is called Secret Empires: How the American Political Class Hides Corruption and Enriches Family and Friends. And so in this book, Peter Schweitzer details, and I think Kyle Bass has referenced this, that the Chinese government for decades now has been buying off Republicans and Democrats in Congress, either like making sure family members get big contracts, or like a family member who's a teacher gets a $500,000 per year salary to tutor a Chinese diplomatic kid in English, stuff like that. And they're even doing that, from what I've heard, here in DC for think tank people. So that's to prevent like some of the economic think tank people here that have key policy, key influence in like economic and trade policy, to say that, oh, China's not evil, China's not, an adversary or foreign combatant. And I think that's why China was not like a trade enemy for years. Even though there's tons of reports out. The U.S. government has reports, a lot of different government agencies, and there's also private sector reports out that the Chinese government has been stealing between $200 billion and $600 billion per year in intellectual property, in research and development, in all that. So yes, the American consumer got cheap goods from China at Walmart, etc., and a lot of those goods broke, and maybe that helped offset a lot of the inflation that the US government has created, but the trade-off was a lot of the value added and innovation China basically took for free. So those could have been new industries and new jobs that the US would have had that are gone. So I don't think we're going to see because Trump has cited this, and President Trump has cited this in his interviews, I do not think that we're going to see this trade war, US versus China, die down anytime soon. And Trump thinks he can win it, that he can get China to stop, but as you guys know, my philosophy on trade wars is no one ends up winning, maybe a small group here or there that's corrupt. So it's going to be more pain. But the Chinese, according to a lot of experts' research, the Chinese have stolen trillions of dollars in value added from the US. And it looks like the US is going to be fighting now to keep it. And I've heard anecdotal stories too from like contractors where like a Chinese employee gets hired and they're fired within a couple months because they realized that they were like scanning documents or stealing emails, stuff like that. So, I mean, I've heard off the record conversations about this, but I think, globally we have a corruption problem, and you could see this also in the China Hustle documentary, where in mainland China, the Chinese companies that are committing fraud here on the US exchanges, they have one set of books for American exchanges and American investors, and then they have the more accurate set of financials and accounting books for the Chinese government and Chinese regulators. So go see the China Hustle. That's cheap. You can do your research on that. And apparently there's a lot of Chinese companies that are also committing accounting fraud. Alibaba is one of the bigger ones, according to Francine McKenna. But I did have to add to some of this story of corruption and craziness, crazy stuff in China. And Miles Kwok talks about how basically like the Chinese government wants him dead. He didn't go into all the details, but he was talking about like the president or chairman of the board of HNA just getting killed in Provence, France, like a crazy James Bond story. And then he was talking about like how the head of Interpol was kidnapped, and how the head of Interpol was like ordered by the Chinese government to do a bunch of crazy stuff. Cole, what do you mean, what is the solution? What is the solution to the trade war? I'm not sure what you mean by, it's kind of a vague question. So ask a little bit more specific question in the comment section. I will answer comments, question and answer later in the live stream. We're only 22 minutes in, so I'll have some time to do this. I'm done with my workout for today. I'm not going out to any Halloween parties. I did that over the weekend. So after this live stream, I'm just going to watch Daredevil Season 3 and ice my knees from my workout. And that's it. Probably didn't need to share the last part, but, whatever. Okay, so anecdotal story time. This is crazy. I don't have the guy's name remembered. He did give me a business card. This was at a cryptocurrency conference earlier this year in DC. And so I was talking with this mainland Chinese entrepreneur. He's a crypto entrepreneur now. And I won't give his name. He didn't give me permission. He was actually thinking during the conversation about potentially going on a podcast, but he said he's too worried if he comes on and says his name, and that if he goes back to China, his family, him or his family will be threatened. And he basically said that he grew up in mainland China. He marched at Tiananmen. He got out as soon as he could when he had saved up enough money to get out. And he said that the large cap technology companies in China are basically run like mafias or drug cartels or crime syndicates. And so, yes, they have like normal business operations, but he says they take it like, the saying is like kill the competition, except like normally Americans don't actually want to go murder the competition. It's just like, oh, I'm going to outcompete you, or, oh, we're going to lower our costs, that type of stuff. Well, it seems that some of the Chinese companies at least have taken this to heart. And so from what he said, he knows two entrepreneurs of small innovative companies that were basically given, in the Godfather movie, there was like an offer you can't refuse, right? There was the offer you can't refuse. So you in Narcos on Netflix, it was plata o plomo, right? Either silver, you take the money, or lead. You take the bullet in the head. And so basically, from what he was saying, his two entrepreneur friends that had really good technology ideas, small little companies, they were approached by large technology companies in China, and they were basically given like the Godfather or Narcos, like Pablo Escobar type of 48-hour offer. And basically, he said they were told that they have 48 hours to either take a large pile of money and sign over all their business and their ideas and their intellectual property and all that to the large technology company, or within 48 hours, their body would disappear and that their family would never find their body. And he said both of his friends refused the money. And he said, sure enough, 48 hours later, both of his friends were gone. Family never found the bodies. So take it for what it's worth. It's an anecdotal story. Some of our listeners are in mainland China. I'm sure some of the Chinese government bots that comment on these videos are going to say that, you can't bash China. China's going to crash the dollar. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of these comments later. Those bots are, I think the Chinese government does pay people to troll on social media and make posts like that. I think also Tesla does too. I think Tesla has a lot of trolls. Okay, let me check my notes again. Yeah, so I think China with this dollar peg, they're going to run out of reserves to try to enforce this dollar peg, especially if they start to run trade deficits. So China needs trade surpluses to build their war hoard because of the dollar peg. So the Chinese citizen should actually have more purchasing power without the dollar peg. The Chinese citizen would benefit more with increased purchasing power in their currency, but China uses the dollar peg strategically for a number of different reasons, and one of those main reasons is the Chinese government siphons off the gains that have accrued that the average Chinese citizen should have had in currency gains, increases in currency purchasing power from being productive over the years, and the Chinese government has siphoned them off for themselves because they say that, oh, we don't want the Chinese citizens to have that benefit. We're just going to allocate, we're going to create our sovereign wealth funds, and we're going to allocate the capital for them because we know better. Which, as a libertarian, limited government, small government type of, Ron Paul libertarian, this alarms me. And yet we have lots of people in the gold community and even some libertarians, that are on China's side, which is kind of head scratching. Because I'm sure if I explained to them how totalitarian and draconian the dollar peg is and how it's actually prevented Chinese people from getting more wealthy, I think they would understand it more. But I think a lot of people who are libertarians don't understand a lot of finance and economics anyway. There's a lot of immoral libertarians too, very unethical ones. I was actually surprised about this. I think I've learned my lesson now that just because they should know better doesn't mean they actually in reality do actually practice what they preach. There's a lot of hypocrites in the libertarian community. I don't trust most of them anymore, to be honest. I think a lot of them are total full of shit and hypocrites too. In fact, I won't mention the guy's name publicly, but there was a libertarian, he's an anarcho-capitalist, okay? So he's like, no government at all. He's written a lot of articles about how there shouldn't be any governments, and yet I just found out from him, because I still talk to him, he's a really smart guy, and he's a very successful businessman and investor, and I just found out from him that he took, because he could, I guess, he took a $200,000 a year government job in the state he lives in. So here's this libertarian, right, who's writing all these articles, bashing the government, saying there needs to be no government at all, and then, in reality, oh, okay, because he just got married, he just took a $200,000 a year job with Cadillac Health Insurance and a retirement plan. Big hypocrite. Welcome to dystopia, right? A lot of Americans are like this now. Big hypocrites. Okay, well, basically, I think people are going to learn the hard way that China has changed a lot in 10 years. That just because China is, the main point I want to stress is just because China is accumulating a lot of physical gold does not mean they have saved themselves. In fact, it's quite the opposite. because based on some of the anecdotal evidence we're hearing now from Kyle Bass, Miles Kwok, many other people, many people who, like I said, lived in China for 10 years or more and interviewed other experts and are now writing books about it. They're interviewed on the Hidden Forces podcast, and we're finding out that, yes, China has a lot of physical gold, but now China has basically a credit bubble Ponzi scheme economy. And potentially, China could be potentially willing to, the Chinese government, because they're not going to be holding the currency. They're buying real estate all over the world. They're buying gold. The Chinese government, it seems, almost willing to hyperinflate their own currency just to maintain a fake GDP, fake economy with jobs, so there's no political revolt. So they're willing to hyperinflate their currency with more stimulus, more QE. Their printing now is twice the size of their GDP. And there's no negative ramifications for the elites because they know what they're doing with the monetary inflation, and it's the Cantillon effect, and they're getting their money out of the country first. It sounds like they're laundering lots and lots of this cash. Yeah, Michael, that sounds about right with what Jim Rickards is saying. Jim Rickards, actually, I was going to mention this. He just put out an article. This was yesterday. It was China's debt bomb is ready to explode. So it's very interesting what China has done with the amount of credit. Because, I mean, it took the U.S. a very, very long time to get tens of trillions of dollars in credit and QE out there. And how quickly China has done it in only about 10 years is insane. But you won't hear that discussed in the gold community. There's very few gold experts that will talk about this. In fact, there's very few. There's some gold experts that are pretending to be experts that I know for a fact that don't even spend 5 minutes a week doing research and still just repeat the same bullshit. I won't name their name publicly. I'm friends with them. I've told them. I called them out privately. Like, you need to do better. You need to do more research. They won't do it. Oh, I have 30 years of experience in markets, Jason. And I know better than you. You know, I've been doing this for 10 years. Intense study every day. Hours a day. So to just claim that you know everything after doing something for 30 years. I mean, look at how much everything has changed. So Stanley Druckenmiller, the dude, he's produced better investing results over his career than pretty much anyone. And if he says things, he can't fully tell what the central banks are doing now. And then you have people saying, oh, I know everything. But Stanley Druckenmiller, who is worth, many hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and he says he can't tell. But then you have these gold people claiming that they know everything and they're not even studying anything anymore. Then it's a little, I wouldn't trust a lot of the gold people. Michael, you nailed it. They are afraid to face the facts. Well, I think, China was their white knight. But China's not a white knight. I mean, China's a big totalitarian government with a big technology, surveillance state. In fact, for me seeing this, if I was in China, I'd be in a lot of trouble. If thankfully I'm not in China right now, although I would like to go visit one day Hong Kong and Shanghai and Beijing. I hear they're really cool. I don't think I'd want to live there, but I would like to visit one day. Okay, so I think I pretty much got, let me check the news stories I have. Gold demand is up though, but we have a dollar, so market related stuff. The stock market had a somewhat of a rally. Charles Payne, who I think is a really smart guy, he's on Fox Business. He actually said yesterday that no matter what happens to the November congressional midterms next week, the stock market's going to go a lot higher. He must have missed the 2008 financial crisis, and he probably was predicting it wouldn't crash. Jim Cramer, though, who's normally Mr. Pumper, he just said that what the market action, the price action, especially late in trading days with institutional selling, is reminding him of the 1987 crash and other stuff. So that, and also 2008. So that's interesting that Cramer's saying that, because normally maybe Cramer broke his Pumper character. Maybe Cramer temporarily broke his Pumper character for a smidgen of honesty. But I thought that was pretty brazen what Charles Payne said, how no matter what happens with the congressional midterms, that the stock market's going to go higher. Especially if the Fed keeps hiking rates. I mean, if the Fed keeps hiking rates... did you guys see that Neil Kashkari, I don't know if he's still at the Fed, but he wrote an op-ed over the weekend, I believe, saying the Fed needs to stop the rate hikes. Otherwise, things will break. So I think people in power are starting to panic. Not everyone, though, but some people. Because remember, Lael Brainerd, who's also at the Fed, she said she doesn't care if the rate hikes cause an inverted yield curve and crash things. They want to continue hiking. So it sounds like we have a divided Fed, like a pretty divided Fed. They're starting to get really worried now based on the market price action. But we do have the dollar index. When we were doing this live stream, the dollar index is almost at 97. It's at 96.91. The VIX is down a little bit. It was at 24 last week. It's at 21.23. It's still pretty high compared to what it was even a couple months ago. And gold's holding up pretty decent. Gold's at, what, 12.19, give or take, despite the dollar continuing to be strong. So people are, what I would say is that institutional money probably is starting to go more to cash and gold. On stock rallies, they are probably, when the stock market does rally, they are unloading more positions. Mate. Fancy what Powell, we are going to keep hiking until something breaks. Well, that's kind of the history of the Federal Reserve for decades now. So Volcker hiked until things broke. And Greenspan in the tech bubble and also the real estate crisis, as he was passing the baton to Bernanke, he hiked until things broke too. So, and this is because, there's way too much credit. Everything's over leveraged. The corporate bonds have gone crazy. The amount of junk debt, I've talked about this at length on past live streams. The amount of junk debt outstanding or near junk debt is just insane. There's a lot of companies that cannot roll over their debt. They don't have the cash flow or the assets. And yet, the stock markets have stayed pretty high. Well, the U.S. stock market has. The Chinese stock market also has not done well. So a lot of other stock markets besides the U.S. stock market has not done well, which I told you guys about this with the historical perspective. There's also an interesting article from Albert Edwards. He's a bank analyst at SocGen. I'll attach a link to that in the information section of this live stream after it's done recording. It says their luck is running out, and he expects a hard landing in China. So you can read that for yourself. I'm not talking about a total collapse in China because the Chinese government just has too much control. But, Kyle Bass, he's a brilliant guy. He nailed the 2008 financial crisis, made a boatload of money for himself and his investors. He's really screwed up the timing of this RMB devaluation. We have a massive RMB devaluation. We have had, I think, small RMB devaluations recently and also in the last couple of years, smaller ones of 5% or so, but he's been betting on a big one, and we just haven't gotten it yet. Big G, well, going to cash temporarily is not a bad idea. If you hold cash long term, if you hold cash for years, you will lose. If you hold cash for 6 months or a year and everything crashes, you have the chance to make generational wealth like in 2008. Imagine if you went to cash a year before the 2008 financial crisis, okay? You had cash to go in there. Okay, maybe you missed the stock market going a little bit higher or some other assets going a little bit higher, but you had the cash to go in there in 2008 and buy quality assets for pennies on the dollar. I bought Buffalo Wild Wings, I think, for $20 a share. Back then, my dad and I did. And the thesis was this was wings, beer. People would still want on the weekends to go out and go eat. Even if they had to cut back, they would still go out once in a while to go watch sports with their friends, get out of the house, and, eat chicken wings and watch sports and drink beer. And that stock went up, I think, in a pretty short amount of time, over sevenfold. Krispy Kreme donuts, because I think the research says that when people are depressed, they tend to eat more sugar. Krispy Kreme donuts, I think, during the 2008 financial crisis, if you bought it then, I think it went up over tenfold. It might have went up over 20-fold. So there were bargains galore during 2008, but you had to have cash. So I would separate that. If you have cash, if you hold a lot of cash over years' time, you will lose. If you have cash at the right period of time, you can win big. So cash is for optionality. It's for opportunity. You don't want to hold up. The problem a lot of pure value investors have made who either don't look at the macro, so they don't do top down, bottom up, they just do bottom up, or they screwed up on the macro situation. The mistake that a lot of money managers and really smart value investors, I'm friends with a lot of these guys, have made is they've been in cash for years, waiting for the cycle to turn and everything to crash. That's the mistake that the value investors have made. These are brilliant guys. They just did not know that the central bankers would change the rules, do QE, that the European Central Bank would expand their balance sheet, be allowed to get the rules changed, expand their balance sheet. The Swiss National Bank would run a Euro peg and then turn it into a technology hedge fund. They only ran a Euro peg for, I think, 3 years or something, and they created hundreds of billions of dollars worth of euros. And then they took that and turned that into a technology fund. Okay, if you would have... And this is the environment we're in. It sucks, man. It's a new normal, though. It's not fair. And when you have some of the smartest guys in finance getting burned like this, you know that it's not an easy environment. Although there are people making it look easy, because some of these guys who have shorted volatility, they made things look easy. If you were just long index funds for years, you would have done it easy. Those index funds are a bubble, though. At some point, they're going to blow up. There's just too much money going into passive, and there's no way it's going to keep going higher. Retail money has been pouring and pouring in, and institutional money has been selling the rallies. Cole, Harry's a broken clock. Exactly. Harry also claims that gold is going to below $600. He's lost bets with people I know Harry Dent has, and he's had to hand over 1 ounce gold coins. Harry sells fear porn. Harry has made a lot of money. He makes millions of dollars a year. I don't know anyone in any other profession who can make millions of dollars a year being basically right once or twice in a 30-year career. But Harry Dent has done it. And I think he just sold his company to Stansberry. So he is a marketing machine that obfuscates or ignores his real track record, but his track record is atrocious, like you said, Cole. Harry Dent is a smart guy, brilliant guy. Harry Dent's a brilliant guy. He's just, the way he's looking at markets is wrong. I think he was predicting the Dow would go up to 30,000 right before the 2008 financial crisis. And then after the crash, after the 2008 financial crisis, then Harry Dent put out his book that the crash was going to be even bigger than 2008. And he claimed that he called the crash right, even though it's not true. Okay, well, I'm done with my notes as far as I can tell, and it looks like I have mentioned all the current events that I wanted to mention. And China, Kyle Bass also mentioned this, that China's now running a current account deficit. So that's big, that China's not going to have as much trade surplus money coming in, relying on. So they're not going to have as much ammunition to defend their currency. They're not going to have as much ammunition to intervene in markets or stuff as a past, because they have to protect themselves first. Okay, now I'm going to look at listener Q&A. I already answered some of them. Mate, spelled the really long way, phonetically. Central banks can print all the money they like and buy up all the gold and all the cryptos. It would be nice if the central banks were required to do independent financial audits, right? At least once a year. But I don't think any of them are doing that. And the assets and stuff that they hand over publicly is probably not accurate. In theory, they could do that. But the currency markets would check some of this with some exchange rates, because there's only so much manipulation, I think, without central banks trying to coordinate, that central banks can do managing exchange rates. I mean, look at Brazil. So their central bank tried like hell to manipulate their dollar Brazilian real exchange rate, and they just didn't have the ammunition. And they did all these, they were even that desperate to do these synthetic currency swaps. And so now Brazil has tons of liabilities on the taxpayer that they shouldn't. because the Brazilian central bank thought we need to manipulate our exchange rate. They tried really hard and couldn't. So it depends on the country. It depends how much reserves the country has to do. Look at Hong Kong. I just mentioned this earlier in the live stream today. Hong Kong has burned through 70% of their reserves to defend their dollar peg. Okay, so that's not sustainable. And what Kyle Bass and Miles Kwok were discussing in their excellent Real Vision television conversation that was released on Friday was that Hong Kong is going to need a bailout in the future, and that probably the Chinese Communist Party, mainland Chinese government, will probably have to swallow the Bank of Hong Kong and maybe the entire Hong Kong government. So there will not be any pretense of Hong Kong being separate and more capitalist or more free market. And this is the danger with the currency pegs. This is the danger with the currency pegs. I mean, the Swiss National Bank abandoned their euro peg. China has this immense dollar peg, but they, at some point, you have all these gold community people and all these alternative media people claiming that China's going to crash the dollar. As long as China's running a dollar peg, they really can't crash the dollar, okay? They don't want to. They still sell a lot of goods into the U.S., okay? Even with these trade wars escalating, Chinese companies still sell a ton of stuff here. Okay, unless that stops, unless China abandons the dollar peg entirely, then I don't see any way that China can crash the dollar. Okay? If things change, then my opinion will change. But as of right now, I don't see any way that China can crash the dollar. They're still running a dollar peg, and they would crash their own companies, a lot of them. Because, yes, China is selling more into Europe, but Europe's in even more of a mess right now, European Union is, than the U.S. is. Big G, it is always wise to diversify your assets. Holding fiat is never really that great an idea. Well, we discussed this already. So if you're holding it for a year or two and you time it right, there's going to be bargains. You'll have the opportunity to build generational wealth. People who bought stocks with blood in the street in 2008, and I'm not talking, well, I did speculate on some very risky stocks. I bought like a couple hundred shares of a biotech stock that went from like $3 down to like 10 cents, and I bought a couple hundred shares of that biotech stock, and I think I sold it like 18 months later after it crashed down to 10 cents. I think I sold it for a couple dollars a share. But I knew that was speculative. And I bought Lundin Mining, which was backed by billionaire Lucas Lundin, the copper miner. And I knew China was doing all that copper stimulus, all that central planning and all the infrastructure programs. And they announced the big stimulus package in 2008-9. So I knew that China was going to create a lot of copper demand that was going to be artificial. And my thesis was that the billionaire Lucas Lundin would keep afloat Lundin Mining, so it dropped. Those share prices crashed, and I think they went as low as around 30 cents a share, and I bought about 500 shares at 30 cents each, and they had a producing mine with Freeport-McMoRan, I think in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that stock went from about 2 years, it went from like 30 cents to $5 because of the fake recovery with all the money printing and China stimulus, and the copper price rallied really, really hard. So you do need cash for opportunity. Now, if you hold cash, like I said, long-term for years and years and years, you're going to be devalued. Yes, Dave Jones, it is live. This is a live stream. You're going to sell, Dave, you're going to sell all of your silver for Ripple? Ripple's like the bankster currency. Ben Bernanke, Bill Clinton, they have a troll army of, I think, paid pumpers on Twitter. Some of them might not be paid. They just might be true believers. I am not a believer in Ripple. Nick K. No wonder the house prices in Canada have gone haywire. Yep. So I spoke on Twitter. Mark Cohodes was in this thread, the famed short seller and investor on Wall Street. He was one of the top short sellers for a long time. And this lady from Vancouver reached out to him, and I was reading through the thread and interacting with her on Twitter. And she was basically saying the politicians in Vancouver are well aware that a lot of the money that is being used to buy, or for years now, over a decade, property like houses in Vancouver is from like drug money and laundered Chinese money. And she said the politicians didn't care because it meant higher and higher property taxes, higher and higher property values. And so the government in Vancouver then didn't care as long as it meant that they could meet their government budget deficit, meet certain pension fund obligations, and raise those budgets. But now the people, it sounds like, Nick, are revolting in Vancouver. And there's people in Vancouver, from what it sounds like, who are making like $40,000 a year, like pretty normal white blue collar jobs or entry level white collar jobs, and it sounds like that they can't afford rent. Like I've heard stories from people that they still have to live, like they can only afford to like rent a basement, or they have to have like 6 roommates, and they have to commute like 90 minutes away. So they're destroying, by these greedy politicians, by allowing all this money to come in that was probably like ill-gotten, they've destroyed their whole culture and community. It's really sad. And this is why politicians should not have this much power from either, well, for Americans, from either party. And this is why the government should be a lot smaller. Because big government didn't solve that problem. Dave Jones, you think that Bitcoin and Ethereum can be hijacked by China? Ripple, not so much. Ripple has an enormous supply problem. Ripple has an enormous amount of supply. And I think also the Ripple Corporation owns a large chunk of it. So right now they haven't flooded the market with it. Ethereum, what a lot of people have not talked about is, I think the supply a couple of years ago of Ethereum was around 90 million Ether. And I think now it's over 102 million. So only in a couple of years, it's already gone up a lot. Ethereum's demand going forward is questionable to me because of all these governments, whether it's developed countries or developing countries, cracking down on initial coin offerings. And a lot of people now are well aware that there's tons of fraud and scams in initial coin offerings. I still get tons of spam emails offering me like deals to do stupid review videos to help with their initial coin offering and other stuff. I've turned them all down, as you guys know, because it's just not worth the money ruining my reputation like that. All the money is debt created out of thin air. Gold can be confiscated, land taxed to the max. The elites have the world by the balls. They own us, the serfs. Yep. Well, the more people we wake up, the better. More people we wake up, the better. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to wake up. A lot of people just want a halfway decent job and spend money or go do drugs. That's why opiates are popular, because people don't like reality. Or doctors have over prescribed opiates too. It's probably got a little off on tangent. I actually saw a really horrible article saying that like when people get cancer now, that within 2 years they will go back. The 50 shot, 50% probability that once you get cancer in the United States, 50% probability within 2 years you will blow through your savings and or declare bankruptcy. It's really sad. The free market needs to fix this. Innovation needs to fix this. Big pharma is not capitalism or free markets. The FDA is part of the problem that's causing the costs to go through the roof. There needs to be more readily available generic prescriptions. And the FDA, how long it takes to get these medicines to market is what's causing the costs to go astronomically high. There's just not enough competition. The other story I saw that was interesting, that was non-China related for this live stream, was that the average American now is only making, I think, about a little under $31,000 per year. So that's before taxes. After taxes, that's even worse. So only making about $31,000 per year. And that's, I think, after the Trump tax cuts. So if you live in a major city, either New York City metro area, DC metro area like here, or San Francisco, Silicon Valley area, $31,000 before taxes is not going to go far at all. You're not going to have very much of a life. Serfs might be an improvement. They kept more of their funds. Well, didn't serfs also have to fight for their lord? They had to fight in wars. They were required to, or they would be murdered. We are serfs, but a lot of people don't really realize that. So we're kind of wage slaves or debt serfs right now. but it's a different variation. I mean, the control mechanisms of society, Big G, are a lot more sophisticated and complicated than in the past. Back through history, you know, what the serfs had was religion. And it was like God ordained the Lord or the king to remain in power, and you had to obey because of that, because God said so. Things have changed. The level of control and sophistication is, in certain ways, it's more subtle. In certain ways, it's more complex. A lot of people don't know that they're getting programmed by what's on mainstream media and etc. Michael Wilson, what is the mathematical limit for debt to GDP? At what point does the debt become too high to service? Well, then the governments will just change the way they calculate GDP. GDP, so almost every major government is doing fraudulent GDP now. Now, some of them are more egregious and worse than others. Basically, from what I've heard in China, the Chinese Communist Party tells their economists and the PBOC and all those bureaucrats in economic planning that they want 6% GDP, and then they go and rejigger the formula, change the formula, tweak things out so they get a certain type of GDP number. I don't know if things are quite that bad in the US. Now, I've heard stories in the past that sometimes they were for a specific quarter. Like I've heard, I think Lyndon B. Johnson in the past yell at past Fed chairmen. I believe I read articles about that, where he would say, oh, I want GDP to look like this so Democrats will win, you know, these seats in the House, and then Lyndon B. Johnson could get re-election. Debt to GDP, so the math studies, I think it was Reinhardt and Rogoff, and I think it was 90% to 100% debt to GDP ratio, but it depends if you consider like unfunded liabilities in there as debt. But the bottom line is, I mean, these governments, all these, and this is, you won't hear President Trump talk about this. So all this GDP growth that people are touting, it's all nominal. It's all nominal GDP growth. And then, you know, later, the same games that have been happening for over 10 years happen. There's down revisions, there's seasonal adjustments, it's not counting a real inflation rate. So, yes, some people are getting wage increases. Yes, more jobs are being created, although in a lot of cases, it's part-time jobs. So there's, and those part-time jobs are being counted as full-time jobs. Hey, Nick, I think you might be onto something. There's a lot of people that are calling that. Kyle Bass, I think, is one. China's going to have a lot of problems. Just because China has that much gold, at the current gold price, that 25,000 tons or more of gold is not a lot of money. I think it's only a little over $1 trillion. And I don't think China wants to sell it, but China's blowing through their reserves, defending their currency peg and their other problems. So I would encourage you to do more research with what Kyle Bass has to say. Now, I wouldn't short the RMB right now because China can play games. They can play games with their currency exchange rate. There's stuff they could do to delay. They've delayed already a big devaluation in the RMB for at least like 3 years, because I remember Kyle Bass talking about this 3 or 4 years ago. He is saying that China was going to have to devalue, and he obviously, on the timing part, like I said, he's a brilliant guy. Long-term track record is good, but he screwed up the timing of this particular trade. But he may be right, though, in the next year or two. We'll see. Okay, not announcing water break. I already took one. Ha! To the guy who commented on the last live stream telling me not to announce my water breaks. I was going to make an Eddie Murphy Coming to America joke there, but we have like a PG-13 audience. Joe Lazaro, Alistair is a gold pumper. Yeah, he's too much gold. He's a really smart guy. I respect him a lot. But, you know, if you went back and read his articles from 2010 and 11, they're pretty much the same as now. Despite all the things, we could spend hours talking about all the different things that have changed since 2010, 11 to now. And basically, he just ignores all the reality of the stuff that has changed and says, you know, gold's still going to win, China's going to win. And I think it's good to hold gold, but I don't know if China's going to win anymore. Let's just put it that way. There's a lot. China has done a lot, overplayed their hand, done a lot of very dumb things, and it looks like that President Trump is dead serious about stopping the intellectual property being stolen. Now, China may still be able to get some of it, but it's going to slow down drastically compared to what it used to be. It's going to be way harder. And, you know, an investing opportunity then would be the government and companies investing more in cybersecurity. So you're going to see those cybersecurity companies, the valuations are high. I would wait for a big pullback or crash in a stock market crash, but those cybersecurity companies, if that would be one of the ways to protect themselves from IP theft, is the cybersecurity companies. The valuations on those are sky high, and they were over 40 times earnings for like Palo Alto Networks and those guys. So now's not really the right time to buy unless you're just doing a trade. But if you're a long-term investor or value investor, you're not going to find value right now. Now, if you're just doing like a short-term trade and, you know, it's announced that like there's breaches and stuff like that, then Hack could still go up in the short term. But I think it was cheaper a couple years ago when I did a short video a couple years ago talking about Hack, and I think it's already up 40%. Hack is the cybersecurity ETF. That's the basket of the cybersecurity stocks. Thank you for the $10 tip on Super Chat. I appreciate it. Hello, Nick. It's all about reading the charts. If the Dow starts making lower highs, get the hell out. Well, I think what we're seeing is the normal games that are played with like the plunge protection team and intraday rallies. If like the futures market or the stock market opens up down, normally in the past you would see a stock market rally then by the end of the day. Whether it was actual buyers of stock, like real market participants or plunge protection teams or whatever. But what I'm seeing lately, at least for the last couple weeks or month, is that towards the end of the day, you see stocks start to rally midday and earlier in the afternoon, and then towards the end of the day, you see the institutional money, the professionals. The saying for the stock market is amateurs open the market. So like the dentist, the doctor, the lawyer, those guys, they call their broker in the morning, or they program a trade before they go to bed, or they program a trade early in the morning before they go to work, and that trade gets put into the order books in the morning. And so the amateurs open the market and the professionals close it. Because think about it, like doctors, lawyers, you know, normal professionals don't have the time to be at 4 o'clock or 4:30 when the stock market closes. So only the market professionals are the ones that are making those trades. And what we're seeing now for a month is that the market professionals, the institutional investors, are fading the rallies. Now, I'm not calling for an immediate stock market crash, but if this continues, if the Fed continues to rate hike, all the other reasons I outlined on past live streams, this is going to accelerate a topping process. Unless, of course, the Fed or other central banks reverse course and go with more QE. I believe the European Central Bank said they're not going to do any more purchases soon, but they said they won't sell. They said you're just not going to do any more buys, which is kind of weird. And they don't have a plan for Italy. Italy's like a big disaster. Italy is a big country with a lot of debt problems, a lot of non-performing loans in their banks, a lot of government debt. I don't think the ECB has a good plan for Italy. I think Italy would probably rather leave the euro and go back to the Italian lira and devalue. But what's probably going to happen is the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government and the U.S. taxpayer by default then are going to end up probably bailing out the ECB, German banks, the Italian government, etc. As a libertarian and a U.S. taxpayer, I do not like this. But I don't have a vote in the matter. Okay, guys. Well, we're over an hour. I see a lot more questions coming in. I'm going to take... before I shut this down, I have to read this. This is freaking hilarious. Vention Magtao. Buying XRP is like sleeping with a transsexual. No amount of makeup or fake boobs will turn that person into a woman. Oh, man. Wait, did you mean another crypto? It says, same with XRP. Nothing can make that centralized junk into a decent cryptocurrency. I think you meant another cryptocurrency because you mentioned XRP twice. I think you meant another one. Okay, well, there is a lot more questions in the chat here. It's getting late. I got some stuff to do before bed. And if you have more questions and comments, just put them in the comment section below the video after the live chat is done. That's it for right now. I'm getting tired. Okay, good night, guys. Happy Halloween.